philosopher's pupil, Alexander the Great. By his mid-20s, Alexander of Macedon had led a local army out of Greece and pushed his borders across the known world, stretching from the banks of the Danube all the way to the Indus. While these maps trace the path of his phalanxes, the ancient record traces another path, that of his character, and not all were as captured by the myth of the man, many questioning the man and the mind behind this movement. Contemporary accounts provide a sharp contrast to his idealized features. They describe a man frequently consumed by excessive drinking, crippling vanity, and sudden violent rage. To understand how history graded this famous student of its greatest philosopher, we can evaluate him through three specific lenses: the teaching of his tutor, Aristotle, the rejection of his harshest critic, Diogenes, and the scrutiny of the Romans who followed him. Aristotle and the police. Classical philosophers believed that true historical worth was not a matter of land acquired, but of a man's moral utility and his ability to master his own nature. In 343 BC, King Philip sought the greatest mind in Greece to educate his son. He hired Aristotle. Aristotle's political philosophy centered entirely on the Greek polis, a small, homogeneous city-state where citizens could participate directly in local government. But as Alexander marched, he shattered the autonomy of those very city-states, swallowing the small Greek world into a massive, borderless empire. This new Hellenistic kingdom was too diverse and too vast for the intimate politics Aristotle had championed in his lecture halls. By utilizing the logic and rhetoric of his education to unite a fractured world under a single throne, Alexander both used the fruits of the Greek polis to conquer the world, but also to destroy the environment his teacher considered the only viable home for a virtuous and intellectual life to grow. Alexander envisioned conquering the vast Persian Empire and integrating its diverse peoples. He was a cosmopolitan thinker. His relationship with his teacher was permanently poisoned later in life when Alexander executed Aristotle's nephew for refusing to bow to him in the Persian style. But it was also under Aristotle that Alexander studied Homer. Alexander the Great revered Homer and used his epics as a primary source of inspiration. He actually carried copies of both the Iliad and the Odyssey with him throughout his military campaigns. Most notably, Alexander modeled his own life in pursuit of glory directly on the Homeric hero Achilles. He even believed that Homer's poetry had prophesied his own courage and greatness. What truly drove Alexander was an overwhelming desire for immortal fame. He modeled his life directly on Achilles, who famously learned from a prophecy that he could either live a long, quiet life or die young in battle and achieve everlasting glory. Achilles chose to sacrifice his life to avenge his friend and secured his legacy. For Alexander, as for Achilles, risking death for the sake of immortal virtue and glorious reputation was the highest possible human achievement. Alexander, in this way, was a bridge between the pre-Socratic world of mythology, one of glory and immortal name, and the birth of the Socratic life focused on morality and rational virtue, which the Stoics would later pick up and become dominant in promoting. Diogenes the Cynic. Diogenes the Cynic offered the most direct challenge to the king's authority. Living in radical poverty on the streets of Athens by choice, for the Cynics, true kingship was found in self-governance. The only command that mattered was the command of one's own desires. When the world's most powerful man stood over the philosopher and offered him any gift, Diogenes, who was sunbathing, had Alexander's shadow cast over him, and asked only that the king step out of his sunlight. Another story tells where Alexander once found Diogenes sleeping and tried to playfully scold him by quoting a line from Homer: "To sleep all the night becomes not a man who gives counsel." Still half asleep, Diogenes instantly fired back with the very next line of the poem: "To whom the people are trusted, and many a care." These stories capture perfectly the essence of Diogenes. A cynic philosopher, he completely rejected conventional values like wealth, power, and fame, choosing instead a life of extreme poverty. Because he needed absolutely nothing, he was entirely unimpressed by Alexander's immense status, which did little more for him than block his sun. Later philosophers greatly admired how Diogenes used this radical independence to speak fearlessly to kings and to tyrants. This rejection of material power highlighted the king's greatest weakness. His boundless ambitions meant he would never truly possess enough. To this ancient mind, this encounter proved that the quiet mastery of one's own needs was more significant than the loud conquest of an entire civilization. The Roman Critique. Centuries later, the Roman Republic looked back at Alexander as the ultimate standard for military achievement. Julius Caesar reportedly wept when he realized that at 32 Alexander had conquered a world while Caesar himself had done nothing of the kind. While the first Roman emperor, Augustus, viewed the Macedonians' legacy with much more skepticism. Augustus criticized Alexander for weeping over a lack of new lands to invade, noting that he had failed to see the real task was not winning an empire, but in organizing it. This Roman critique suggests that the true wisdom lies in the difficult work of administration, believing that ordering a nation requires more virtue than taking one by the sword. This we should expect from a civilization like the Romans, who worshiped Jupiter, the god of order himself. Conclusion. Ancient historians treated Alexander's life as a canvas, using his biography to illustrate their own moral and political debates. We are left to decide if he was a visionary who bridged cultures, or was he a man who was ultimately defeated by his own lack of restraint. Ultimately, supreme power offers no defense against oneself, nor does it ensure wisdom. A conqueror of world remains answerable to a philosopher in a gutter. The Roman moral perspective. If you asked a historian in ancient Rome to evaluate Alexander, they wouldn't spend much time analyzing his troop movements or plotting out his supply lines on a map. To the Romans, history was a branch of moral philosophy. Unlike today's revisionist history, which looks back into time and finds every flaw to feel morally superior, the Romans looked at history as a collection of vices and virtues from which we could learn what a golden age and what a tyrannical age looks like. They believed you couldn't measure a leader by the size of their territory. You had to evaluate the conditions of their character and the state of their soul. We can see this exact framework in the writings of Plutarch. Rather than a standard timeline of events, Plutarch produced a collection of essays known as the Moria, which functions much more like a moral ledger of historical figures. To understand Alexander the way Plutarch did, we have to look past the physical lands he conquered and weigh the lifelong war waged between his virtues and his vices. The virtue column. Plutarch highlights a surprising level of philosophical detachment from the material wealth that Alexander possessed. In one account, Alexander offered a friend named Purlius a massive gift. When Purlius protested that he didn't need nearly that much, Alexander simply replied that while a smaller amount might be enough for a friend to accept, it was not enough for a king to give. He also prioritized ruthless pragmatism over royal vanity. Before a major battle, he ordered his Macedonian soldiers to shave off their beards entirely. He knew that in close quarter combat, facial hair was just a convenient handle for an enemy to grab hold of. These flashes of grounded realism are remarkable when you consider the sheer volume of propaganda swirling around him. The mortal king. Across his empire, state-sponsored propaganda actively hailed Alexander as a living god, but Plutarch records a moment that punctuates this mythology. During a siege, Alexander took an arrow straight through the leg. As his followers rushed to his side, panicking over their supposedly immortal king, Alexander looked at the wound and pointed out that he was bleeding normal human blood, not ichor, the mythical golden fluid that was said to flow through the veins of the gods. For ancient philosophers, this was the highest display of virtue. Alexander's true triumph in that moment was maintaining the intellectual restraint to recognize his own humanity while wielding absolute, unchecked power. He had not fallen into hubris, he had demonstrated true nobility. The vice column. Sycophancy and excess. But the moral ledger has to be balanced. To present a complete moral account, Plutarch rigorously documented the king's very mortal flaws. He points to the official royal journals, which regularly log days where the supposedly unstoppable conqueror simply slept off hangovers from bouts of extreme drunkenness, surrendering entirely to his earthly passions. Plutarch viewed these physical excesses as symptoms of a much deeper structural disease. In his essays, he identifies sycophancy, the act of extreme self-serving flattery, as the most corrosive danger any leader can face. Flatterers fed his ego to intentionally isolate him from reality. Cut off from honest feedback, Alexander executed loyal generals like Parmenio and Callisthenes. Trapped in this toxic echo chamber, he functioned less like a leader and more like a paranoid, barbaric idiot. Alexander could defeat any army on a battlefield, but he completely failed to conquer his own ego, and he failed to neutralize the sycophants who weaponized it against him. The deathbed reflection. This eternal war finally reached its stalemate on his deathbed, where, stripped of his power, his sharp, grounded self-awareness briefly returned. Looking around at his companions as he lay dying, he made a dry, highly calculating final observation. "I see that my funeral rites will be imposing," indicating that he saw the chaos that was to come after his death, where the empire broke up. That single quote encapsulates Plutarch's ultimate lesson for Roman leadership. Holding immense power does not grant you wisdom. It merely amplifies the flaws you already have and brutally tests the limits of your own restraint. In the eyes of the ancient philosophers, true greatness is never measured by the sheer size of the empire you manage to conquer. It is measured entirely by the grueling, lifelong battle for self-mastery.